Today we looked at perception and the various ways in which we perceive things and how that impacts on our reality. Perception is obviously a subjective thing because we all have a unique perception of the reality that's happening around us, and our own lives are only seen from our own perspective. So the things that happen externally from our own internal lives are down to interpretation, and we obviously make a subjective interpretation of what is happening around us. Other people's behaviours and their responses to things, the way they do things, and things that they say are all subject to our personal interpretation, and that's a matter of perception, as we looked at today. So being so variable in terms of what it is and where it comes from and what it can do, we need to appreciate, first of all, that perception is as unique as we are. Everybody who goes through a certain passage of time in the same place, whether it be a family or a company or a conglomerate of any kind or a community gathering, they all see as individual units a slightly different perspective on everything that's happening as it's happening. And we went into some detail in this in session 1 as to how we see things as a singularity. So we've covered that ground already. What I'm looking at today is how that variance of perception can affect the dynamic of a culture or a community and turn what can be a fairly straightforward sequence of events into something of a nightmare just by the way we look at things. So the first thing I want to write down here is reactions. We've already looked at trigger impacts and the emotional quotient that goes along with trigger impacts, how we can manage those more effectively. But this is another level in self-management, really, because we're looking at the emotional quotient of our reactions and how we perceive things to be immediately that they happen or in the moment that they're presented to us may be rather different to the way we perceive things if we give ourselves the chance to step back and take a breath and look objectively at the situation. Because ultimately what we want to introduce into the equation here is empathy.
Empathy is the understanding of another person's point of view,
i.e. taking into account another person's perspective. And when we can do this, we may find ourselves to be right in our assumptions, and we may find ourselves to be wrong in our assumptions. At the end of the day, there really isn't a right or a wrong. There is reality, and then there is perception of reality. So ultimately what you could say is that our reactions equal our reality. Because the way we react to something, the way we respond to a situation, an environment, or a person's behaviour determines how we see the reality of that situation. Now, one of the things that we looked at in the session today was the speed with which things change. And you may remember us catching a ball, a big fluffy ball, and throwing it at each other after the event, which illustrated the speed with which our brain will switch from one train of thought to another, given a stimulus. So, for example, if you're sitting alone in your lounge or in your kitchen and you're feeling a bit down and you're having a good mope and it's really bad, and the doorbell goes, so you go and answer the door, and by the time you've left the kitchen and got to the door, you're in a different mindset. You're thinking about who's on the other side of the door, you're thinking about what you're going to say, there are a million other things now going through your mind than the thing that you were concentrating on and that was getting you down so much a couple of minutes or even less few seconds beforehand. And the catching the ball exercise that we did in session illustrates the speed with which our brain will change from one mode of thought or train of thought to another. This is something that we can use to work in our favour, because we can actively encourage our brains to change thought tracks when we decide, which we have to do in advance, of course. We have to decide that the one that we're taking isn't benefiting us in any way. It's not doing us any good. So if we're sitting there and we're having a really good mope to each other, to ourselves rather, and we're really down, and it's awful and sad and horrible, that's a perception of reality that we've adopted at that time. It's not actually reality, it's our perception of reality. So getting a handle on the difference is really, really important to our personal progress, because if we've got a handle on this, we can overcome things much more easily, and that's valuable. Another thing that we looked at today was the changes of perception that can happen according to our environment. So for example, we're walking through a forest and it's beautiful, it's dappled light and there's bird song, and it's a really lovely scene. Then that's one perspective that we can have on forest land. If it's dark and we're lost and there are scary things out there that are making noises and there could be monsters, our perspective on the same forest, exactly the same forest, will be very different. And this is another example of the way our perceptions produce potentials in reality. And fear is something that we all suffer too much from. So there are polarities that we need to remind ourselves of here. There's love and there's fear. A lot of people think that the opposite of love is hate. But hate is actually an amalgamation, it's an alloy of emotions. Hate can be derived from anything from jealousy to resentment to avarice or anything. Hate can derive itself from all number of things, but it's not a pure emotion. Fear is the pure emotion, and fear underpins all elements of negative emotion, including hatred and anger and jealousy and etc. etc. Fear is the underpin, it's the anchor to these feelings. Love is its polar opposite. So love correspondingly goes with things like kindness and care, joy, generosity. Things that engender a positive goodwill feeling in us are sourced or rooted in love. And these two are, as we looked at last week, energies. They are the energies of emotional currency. So these energies exchange through the workplace, the family, the community, wherever we're looking, and they can be transformed. They can transform things. They're remarkably powerful, these energies. And used in the right way, as we discussed last week, we can see huge changes manifest purely from intent, belief, and manifestation of a new reality. This all comes down to our perception of the way things are. And lastly, what we looked at today was the extent to which this root system goes. We have essentially a communication or a collaboration system, which you could call, that's what I used, connectivity. That's right. The connectivity of everything. This is one thing that we have a perspective on, how connected we are, how communicative we are with others, the way in which information flows and how good it is, that sort of thing. So these are perceptions of things that materialize as they do. And these are all interwoven, interconnected with the way people behave with each other and the things that they do in their own right. Then there's the root system. What's underneath that?
And what's underneath that is going to be an amalgam of emotions and responses, individuals, personalities, the way people are and the way people deal with things.
So these two roots, they come together, and one way or the other, they make for connectivity. So as you can see, the train leads from perception, our original impression of the way something is, through the reactions and the reality, cross-reference of the two. These two sources, the emotional roots of the way we respond, the way we feel about things, and ultimately to a connectivity. So this is the position that perception has in the mix that we're looking at. There'll be lots of links left for you in the places where you find them, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much for being with me. Take care. I'll see you later. Bye.